Well, friends in Christ, Joe South some years ago had a song titled Games People Play. And in that song, the narrative shares that people are attracted to playing games. And I know in the dating process, everyone says sometimes they've experienced the game player. Maybe you've been a game player, or maybe you've been a victim of a game player. It's a universal thing. You don't think it happens? It happens quite easily. As a matter of fact, there's a game that people can play to give illustration of what this game playing does. Maybe you've played it. You've gone to a party and they tell you to draw a card, and you can't see the face value of the card, and they just put it on your forehead like that. And then you go for an hour figuring out what card you have on your face. And you can tell by the way people react to you of where you belong in the pecking order, right? So if you got a king, you're high. So everyone's going to be seeing the king. They're like, I don't have that king, so they're going to be bowing down to you. You can figure out, oh, I must be top of the line here. And I feel sorry for the guy that's got the ace. Aces are low. What's going to happen there? They're going to be dismiss him. You're not worth my time. And would you not be surprised that at the end of the game, when it's time to line up, aces low, kings high, that people phenomenally line up just according to the numbers. Games people play. It happens everywhere. Have you ever seen a school cafeteria? You got people putting themselves in different categories. You got the table of the jocks. You got the table of the intellects and the cool. You got the table of the cool kids. And then you got kids who just don't know where they belong, the table of the rejects. It's all around us. I remember in college, one of my friends thought they would push the envelope a little bit. He said to my table, what do you think would happen if I go over there and take my lunch tray and sit with the college jocks over there, the college football players? And we warned, don't do it, don't do it. I'm going to try this. So he went over to sit with the college jocks, and it didn't last very long. Neither did his food on the tray. He came back a big mess and said, well, that didn't work. And we kind of knew what the result was going to be anyway. Culture, society has a way of marginalizing people. That's what sinful people unfortunately do. And you look at this gospel today, and you see Jesus is having to deal with marginalization. He is on his way from Galilee to Jerusalem, and he could have gone around Samaria because, as you heard in the gospel reading, the Jews don't have some relations with the Samaritans, and Samaritans don't have a relationship with the Jews. So there were many routes that the Jews could use to avoid Samaria. But John said no, he had to go through Samaria. He had to go through Samaria. There was no choice. So Jesus is taking his lunch tray because he had to sit at the lunch table of what is called Jacob's well. There was no choice. Jesus had to sit at this table. And there at this table, lo and behold, is a Samaritan. And not just a Samaritan, but a woman. Those are two categories that are marginalized in society in the time of Christ, and Jesus violates both of them. He crosses the barriers, breaks down the walls, because he had to. And so he takes his lunch tray to sit at the table of Jacob's well with this Samaritan woman, and he says, hey, could you give me some water off your lunch tray? And the woman's like, what? Why are you a Jew talking to me, a Samaritan woman? Why are you even engaging in conversation with me? What is all this about? And the conversation continues to go on, where Jesus tells her that if you would know who's asking you for a drink of water from your lunch tray, you would be asking from me water from my lunch tray, because I have living water. I've got water that's better than yours. And he who drinks of it will neither thirst ever again or need to come back. It'll be a well springing up for eternity. And so the woman is curious about this water, and she engages conversations like, are you greater than Jacob? I mean, you have nothing to draw this water from. How are you going to get it? But she begins to think that if this guy's lunch tray has got this type of water, I want some. I don't want to have to go here all the time anymore. Notice the time of the day that this is happening. It's at like 12 o'clock. It's in the heat of the day. And she's out there alone. And there's got to be a reason why she's out there alone. She could have gone out from her town, from Sychar, to the well with a number of women her own age in the morning when it's nice and cool, because those buckets of water can get heavy. And you can work up a sweat. So you kind of go out in the mornings or in the evenings. But not this one. She goes out at noon, like she intentionally wants to be alone. And here he invades her privacy. Okay, we're going to talk. And they talk and they converse. And she wants now that living water. And Jesus says to her, call your husband. I mean, the conversation takes a whole different turn here, doesn't it? Call your husband. She said, well, I don't have one. And he said, yeah, you're right. You've had 5 of them. Well, this guy knows my past. That's dangerous. He knows my secrets. 5 husbands. And the one you're living with is not your husband. You're living in sin. And yet Jesus talks to her. This is phenomenal. We don't know why she lost 5 husbands. Was it through divorce or through death? But it just seemed an awful lot. It seemed to communicate a message that this woman has trouble relating with men. And Jesus knows all about her past and still engages in conversation. He violates the wall of talking to a Samaritan. He violates the wall of talking to a woman. And he violates the wall of talking to a horrible sinner. He's breaking walls down left and right in this conversation. And the woman is surprised. And that's the reason why she is there at noon. Because she doesn't want to be having people gossip about her behind her back in the morning or evening detail. When the women from the town are coming out and say, hey, there she is. There's the one that's had 5 husbands and she's living in sin. She didn't want to listen to that. She wanted to just come out alone. And so she would take the sweat of the day in order just to be at peace. And now this Jesus knows everything about her. And so she says, sir, I perceive you're a prophet, because prophets know things, right? And the conversation then goes on to where she actually might even believe that Jesus could be the Christ. And she takes that message back to her village and says, could this not be the Christ? We need to look at this. Jesus had to take his lunch tray that day to have lunch with this woman, because she eventually would become a strong witness to his personhood in her hometown. Jesus broke down walls that day. But the biggest wall that Jesus ever broke down was the wall that we had set up between us and God when we committed sin. It was a huge wall. It was a big wall. And you know what? We didn't really want anybody to knock it down, because that wall kept us from this holy God, and we could hide from our guilt and our shame of our sin. As long as we can keep the glory of God distant from us more than 6 feet, as long as we can keep that glory from shining on the darkness of our sin, we're okay. Keep the wall. But God would not have it. He sent his son, Jesus Christ, into this world to break that wall down, to open the wall, and yet his glory comes through the cross. But what also comes through that broken wall by the cross is not just glory, but love, forgiveness, and peace with God. We heard it today from the epistle reading, Romans chapter 5, that St. Paul wishes to kind of communicate just what Jesus did there on the cross for us. Romans 5 verse 8, heard it this morning. God demonstrates his own love toward us. And that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Yeah, while we were sinners, Christ died for us. God didn't wait for us to become sinless. That would never have happened. He does it while we're sinners. Does it while we're sinners. And then St. Paul wishes to illustrate this truth a little bit further. It kind of makes the knife kind of go deeper, as down into a few verses later, he wants us to know that we're just not sinners. That when we built this wall up by our sinful rejection against God, we're also enemies of God. For while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son. Sinners, enemies, Jesus breaks down walls. Like Jesus had to take his lunch tray to sit at Jacob's well to bring peace with this Samaritan woman, Jesus had to take his lunch tray to Calvary to have peace with you and me. And Paul says accordingly in Romans chapter 5, verse 1, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God. No longer God looks at us in anger towards our sin. No longer does God see us as enemies because the wall has been broken, but God is at peace with us. How blessed gift is that? And even though this wall between us and God has been broken down through the blood of Jesus Christ, let's be honest, we still are game players. We still fight our sinful nature, and we still struggle with marginalization. Like I mentioned, school cafeterias, perfect example of it. Marginalization happens there all the time. You got your groups, and the groups should never, ever mix. That's what you do. The other group is less than you. They're not as good as you. You got to keep that line. And it gets bigger and bigger as you go into bigger and bigger groups of people. There's this thing about nationalism that sometimes can be wrong. Yeah, you love your country, but when you start comparing your country and saying you're better than any country in the world to the point that those Russians aren't someone are lower than us, or the Chinese, or all these other countries. No, everyone is God's people. But the wall of nationalization sometimes helps us, and wrongfully helps us forget that. That those people are God's creatures too. That those people are the same people that God died for. We should not really necessarily see them as the other, but we really kind of need to see them as the same. And God's Holy Spirit can make this happen in our personal lives. It happened in the church at Ephesus, where the Gentiles were building walls against the Jewish converts. They were proclaiming in their church they were the better group than those Jewish convert believers into Christ. And St. Paul had to remind them about a couple things in order to break that wall down. He writes to the Gentiles at Ephesus with these words, remember, verse 12, chapter 2, that you were at the time separate from Christ, excluded from the commonwealth of Israel. You weren't allowed to sit at their table. And strangers to the covenant of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. But now, in Christ Jesus, you who formerly were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ, for he himself is our peace, who made both groups into one, Jews and Gentiles, and broke down the barrier of the dividing wall. If God's Spirit can break the barriers down between the Jews and Gentiles in Ephesus, he can break down the barriers among us as well. So how does this play out, game players, for yourself? Well, we may be small entities when we're talking about nationalism. Maybe we can't make an effect on having this whole country look at Russia and China as differently as God's creatures and redeemed by the blood of Christ as well. Can't maybe get that happen just as individuals, but we can make a difference in our own little world, right? You know, look around you. Look at those tables in your cafeteria in life. Are you still going to look at them as the other? We have an opportunity in a couple of weeks, the new member breakfast coming up. And we have a social gathering when that takes place, that new member breakfast. And so, are you going to make a difference here with God's Spirit? Are you going to take your lunch tray on that day? And are you going to sit with the same old friends? Or on that day, will you take your lunch tray and sit with the other and start breaking walls down? In his name, amen.